The first scream did not come from a patient. It came from the charge nurse, staring through the emergency department's glass entrance as the thunder of rotor blades shook every window in the building. One helicopter would have meant a terrible accident. Two would have signaled a regional disaster. But 8 black military helicopters, descending almost simultaneously onto the hospital landing zone, turned an ordinary Tuesday morning into something no one inside had ever trained for. The emergency room froze for half a heartbeat before exploding into motion. Stretchers raced across polished floors. Doctors shouted medication requests over one another. Security officers struggled to keep frightened visitors away from the entrance, while frightened families watched the sky through tear-filled eyes. Every second seemed to stretch longer than the one before it, and everyone understood the same terrible truth without needing anyone to say it aloud. There would not be enough hands. There would not be enough operating rooms. There might not even be enough hope. Standing beside the medication cabinet was the newest nurse in the hospital, Evelyn Hart. She had been working there for exactly 11 days. Most people barely knew her name. She was 38 years old, carried herself with quiet confidence, and wore the same simple blue scrubs as everyone else. Her chestnut hair was tied into a neat bun that had not loosened despite an already exhausting shift. A thin silver chain disappeared beneath the collar of her uniform, hidden from casual view, and beneath her identification badge rested a small worn metal pin that looked so old most assumed it belonged to a deceased relative. No one had ever asked about it. No one imagined it mattered. Evelyn simply watched the helicopters through the glass, with calm gray eyes that betrayed neither fear nor surprise. The loudspeaker interrupted the growing panic. Mass casualty incident. Level black. All emergency personnel report immediately. Repeat. Mass casualty incident. Level black. The words echoed through every hallway like the opening notes of a storm. Within seconds, physicians sprinted from every direction. Specialists abandoned paperwork. Surgeons rushed downstairs, still wearing protective caps from operations that had barely ended. Administrators flooded into the emergency department, carrying clipboards that suddenly felt useless. The hospital had rehearsed disasters before, but rehearsals never smelled like aviation fuel drifting through automatic doors or sounded like 8 helicopters refusing to stop roaring overhead. Dr. Victor Langley arrived already, shouting instructions before anyone had finished listening. As chief of trauma surgery, he possessed a reputation almost as intimidating as his surgical skill. His voice cut through confusion with military sharpness. Open every trauma bay. Cancel elective surgeries immediately. Call neighboring hospitals. Notify blood bank. Every available surgeon downstairs now. Nurses scattered in every direction. Someone accidentally dropped a tray of instruments. Metal clattered across the floor, but nobody stopped to pick them up. The first helicopter had not even landed completely before military medics were jumping onto the pavement. Evelyn quietly stepped toward the supply room, already calculating inventory. Tourniquets, rapid transfusion kits, airway carts, chest seals, burn blankets, massive hemorrhage medications. She moved without hesitation, collecting exactly what would be needed before anyone requested it. Another nurse looked at her with confusion. How did you know what to grab first? Evelyn simply smiled gently. Sometimes preparation arrives before the emergency. The nurse barely heard the answer before rushing away. The emergency entrance burst open. Soldiers carrying stretchers poured inside in disciplined formation despite blood soaking their uniforms. The first patient was unconscious with devastating chest injuries. The second had severe burns across both arms. The third kept repeating coordinates instead of words. More stretchers followed so quickly they almost touched one another. The emergency room transformed into organized chaos. Blood pressure alarms beeped relentlessly. Oxygen monitors screamed warnings. Families cried from behind security barriers. The smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke, diesel fuel, and fresh blood until the air itself felt heavy. Every face reflected urgency. Every movement carried consequence. Dr. Langley pointed toward Evelyn without recognizing her. You, new nurse, stay clear of the trauma bays until someone tells you otherwise. We cannot afford mistakes today. His words were sharp but not cruel. They reflected the brutal mathematics of disaster. Experience saved lives. Unknown variables endangered them. Evelyn nodded respectfully. Of course, doctor. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply stepped aside exactly as instructed while continuing to observe everything happening around her. Nearby, two veteran nurses exchanged sympathetic glances. Poor woman picked the worst week imaginable to start here. Another whispered back, if she keeps her head down, maybe she'll survive today. Evelyn heard both comments and answered neither. Instead, she noticed something everyone else had missed. One trauma cart carried the wrong airway equipment for pediatric patients, while the incoming casualties were clearly adults. Quietly, without interrupting anyone, she switched the cart with another before the physicians reached for it. Seconds later, an anesthesiologist grabbed the corrected equipment without realizing anything had changed. A tiny adjustment. 30 seconds saved. Nobody noticed. Outside, helicopter number 4 landed before number 3 had fully unloaded. Military police began establishing a secure perimeter. Hospital executives emerged looking increasingly overwhelmed. None of them had expected uniformed officers carrying encrypted communication cases into a civilian emergency department. Then came another surprise. The incoming casualties wore patches from different military branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Even special operations insignias appeared among the wounded. Whatever had happened, it had involved units that almost never trained together. Rumors spread faster than facts. Aircraft collision, terrorist attack, classified exercise, foreign sabotage. Nobody knew the truth, and those who did remained silent. Evelyn continued stocking supplies. Every bandage folded precisely. Every medication checked twice. Every trauma card arranged in exactly the same order. Her movements appeared almost peaceful amid the surrounding storm. An elderly man, sitting quietly in the waiting area, watched her with growing curiosity. He wore an old Veterans Association cap, faded by years beneath the sun. His hands trembled with age, but his eyes remained remarkably sharp. As Evelyn passed him carrying intravenous fluids, the silver pin beneath her identification badge briefly caught the overhead lights. The old man's breathing stopped. His expression changed instantly. Recognition replaced confusion. He slowly rose to his feet despite the protests of his aching knees. "Excuse me, nurse." Evelyn turned kindly. "Yes, sir." The elderly veteran looked toward the hidden pin for only a second before lowering his voice. "I never thought I'd see one of those again." She instinctively covered the pin with her hand. It belonged to someone important. He nodded almost reverently. "It always does." Before she could answer, another explosion of movement interrupted them. 3 more casualties rolled through the doors simultaneously. One had lost consciousness. Another was coding. A third was still clutching the identification tags of a friend who had not survived the flight. Evelyn offered the old veteran an apologetic smile before hurrying back toward the trauma bays. Minutes later, a young surgical resident collapsed into a chair, exhausted after only the first wave. "We can't keep this up," she whispered. "There are too many." Evelyn handed her a bottle of water. "One patient at a time. One decision at a time. That's how impossible days become survivable." The resident looked into Evelyn's calm eyes and somehow found enough strength to stand again. Across the department, Dr. Langley struggled to coordinate incoming teams as radios crackled nonstop. Every operating room had reached capacity. Hallways became temporary treatment zones. Supplies disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Then the loudest helicopter of all descended onto the landing pad. Unlike the others, this aircraft was escorted by armed military vehicles that had appeared without warning. The rotors had barely stopped turning before a high-ranking officer stepped onto the pavement, ignoring the medics rushing around him. His uniform was stained with dust and blood, yet his posture remained perfectly straight. Instead of following the wounded inside, he scanned the emergency department through the glass entrance as though searching for one specific face. His eyes settled on Evelyn. Time seemed to pause. Without hesitation, the officer removed his cap, stood at rigid attention despite a heavily bandaged shoulder, and rendered a flawless military salute directly toward the quiet nurse everyone else had overlooked. The conversations stopped one by one. Doctors turned. Nurses froze. Even the security officers looked confused. The officer's lips moved softly. but in the sudden stillness, the nearest people heard every word. "She's here. Thank God she's here." The emergency department did not erupt into louder chaos after the officer's salute. It became quieter, and somehow that silence was even more unsettling. Conversations faltered in mid-sentence. Hands paused above surgical trays. Nurses exchanged bewildered glances, while physicians searched one another's faces for an explanation that none of them possessed. Dr. Victor Langley frowned toward the entrance, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just witnessed. Decorated officers did not salute newly hired civilian nurses, certainly not in the middle of a mass casualty emergency. Yet the officer remained perfectly still, his salute unwavering, until Evelyn finally acknowledged him with the smallest respectful nod. She offered no dramatic gesture, no smile of recognition, only a calm expression that suggested this moment belonged to the wounded rather than to her. The officer lowered his hand immediately and returned to helping unload casualties, as though nothing unusual had happened. The spell broke. Reality rushed back into the room with another wave of stretchers, another chorus of alarms, another flood of impossible decisions. Dr. Langley turned sharply toward Evelyn. His voice carried authority, but uncertainty had crept beneath it. "Do you know that officer?" Evelyn adjusted a pair of sterile gloves before answering. "We crossed paths a long time ago." The response sounded truthful without revealing anything at all. Before another question could follow, a trauma resident shouted across the department, "We need another chest tube kit now." Evelyn already had one in her hands before anyone finished asking. She reached the bedside, placed the equipment exactly where the surgeon expected it, and stepped away without interrupting the procedure. The movement lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it prevented a frantic search that would have stolen precious time. Another patient arrived in respiratory collapse. A young medic struggled to remember medication dosages, while blood soaked through his sleeves. Evelyn gently steadied his trembling hands. "Breathe once, then give 20 milligrams. You already know this." The medic looked at her, inhaled slowly, and completed the treatment flawlessly. He never asked how she had known exactly what he needed to hear. Around them, the hospital continued drowning beneath the weight of casualties. Every trauma bay was occupied. Recovery rooms became intensive care spaces. Hallways transformed into treatment areas lined with portable monitors and oxygen cylinders. The blood bank warned that supplies were dropping faster than expected. Hospital administrators quietly discussed requesting state assistance. Every decision now carried life or death consequences. Dr. Langley gathered the senior physicians beside a digital patient board, crowded with flashing red indicators. "We have 23 critical patients and only 4 operating rooms available. We cannot save everyone at once. We prioritize survivability." The words hung heavily in the air. Nobody argued because everyone understood the mathematics of catastrophe. Still, accepting those numbers felt like betraying the oath that had brought each of them into medicine. A young surgeon stared at one patient's chart with visible anguish. "He's 22. Another whispered, "The burns are too extensive. We don't have enough teams." Their voices faded into painful silence. Evelyn listened from several steps away. She did not interrupt the discussion. Instead, her eyes traveled across the patient board, memorizing injuries, blood types, estimated transport times, available specialists, operating room turnover, and recovery capacity almost instinctively. Her gaze moved with astonishing speed, assembling patterns invisible to everyone else. She stepped toward Dr. Langley with quiet respect. "Doctor, may I make a suggestion?" He hesitated. Under ordinary circumstances, he would have dismissed the idea without thought. But nothing about today was ordinary. "Speak." She pointed calmly toward 3 names on the board. "Those patients don't need separate surgical teams yet. Stabilize the vascular injury first, move the orthopedic repair to procedure room 3, and assign burn management to intensive care until the airway cases are secure. That opens 1 operating room within 18 minutes. Several physicians stared at her. One resident frowned. "That's impossible. The schedule's already locked." Evelyn shook her head gently. "It's only impossible if everyone stays where they are. Shift the resources instead of the patients." Dr. Langley looked again at the board. His eyes narrowed, then widened. She was right. The rearrangement solved a bottleneck, None of them had noticed. It wasn't magic. It was simply seeing the entire system instead of isolated emergencies. He turned toward the charge nurse. Do it exactly as she said. The staff moved immediately. Within minutes, the impossible began becoming merely difficult. An operating room reopened sooner than expected. Two surgeons, previously waiting for equipment, suddenly had everything they needed. A helicopter medic watched the changes unfold with quiet recognition. He leaned toward another soldier and murmured, "She's doing it again." Just like before. The other soldier answered softly, "I told you she'd find a way." No civilian staff heard them. More casualties poured through the doors. One young soldier arrived unconscious after massive blood loss. His heartbeat weakened with every passing second. 3 physicians surrounded him, while monitors screamed steadily louder. Despite transfusions and medication, his condition continued deteriorating. A resident lowered his eyes. "We're losing him." The room became still. Nobody spoke. Even the alarms seemed distant for one suspended moment. Evelyn walked forward without urgency. She looked at the patient's wounds only once before placing 2 fingers gently against his wrist. Then she spoke in a calm voice that carried surprising certainty. "Raise his left shoulder 6 centimeters. Rotate the pelvis slightly. Stop compressing there. You're collapsing the remaining vessel." The team hesitated. Dr. Langley looked at her. "Do it." The adjustments took only seconds. Almost immediately, fresh blood began reaching the patient's heart more effectively. The monitor changed. One steady beep. Then another. Blood pressure climbed. Oxygen levels improved. The room collectively exhaled. No one cheered. They simply stared. Dr. Langley looked from the monitor back to Evelyn. "How did you know?" She answered while adjusting in 4-line. "I've seen injuries like this before. More times than I wanted to." Before he could press further, a military communications officer hurried into the department, carrying a sealed, encrypted case, handcuffed to his wrist. He ignored hospital executives waiting nearby and walked directly toward a colonel who had just arrived from the landing zone. The case was unlocked using 2 separate authorization keys. Inside rested a secure satellite communication device. The colonel listened for less than 30 seconds before his posture stiffened noticeably. He glanced across the crowded emergency room toward Evelyn. Then he spoke only 4 words. "Understood. We'll inform her." Hospital administrators watched in complete confusion. One stepped forward. "Colonel, what's happening?" The officer offered a polite but firm response. "Classified." Moments later, he approached Evelyn, stopping a respectful distance away despite the surrounding frenzy. "Ma'am." She looked up from a patient. He handed her a sealed envelope, marked with multiple security classifications. She stared at it for a long second before quietly breaking the seal. Inside was a single page. She read every word without changing expression. Then she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her pocket. Dr. Langley finally lost his patience. "Nurse Hart, someone needs to explain what's going on." Evelyn met his eyes. "I wish I could." At that exact moment, every computer screen in the emergency department briefly flickered. Hospital staff looked around in confusion. When the displays returned, a new authorization banner appeared across the internal emergency network. "Emergency Federal Medical Directive active. Effective immediately. All trauma coordination authority temporarily assigned to Evelyn Hart under National Security Protocol. Follow all clinical directives without delay." The room fell utterly silent. Even the monitors seemed quieter as every pair of eyes slowly turned toward the nurse no one had believed important only an hour earlier. No one knew who she truly was. But whatever life Evelyn Hart had lived before walking into this hospital, it had just reached out from the shadows and taken command. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the emergency department surged back into motion, but something fundamental had changed. Nobody questioned the authorization on the screens. They questioned everything they thought they knew about the quiet nurse who had spent 11 days stocking supplies, comforting frightened patients, and blending so completely into the background that most people had forgotten she was new. Dr. Victor Langley looked from the glowing federal directive to Evelyn, then back to the monitors as if expecting the message to disappear. It remained. Every computer in the hospital displayed the same order. Nurses who had once rushed past her now instinctively waited for instructions. Surgeons who had built careers on confidence found themselves watching her with cautious respect. Evelyn took one slow breath, not because she doubted herself, but because she understood what accepting this authority would awaken. She had buried this part of her life years ago. She had promised herself she would never carry it again unless there was no other choice. Today had become that choice. She stepped toward the central patient board, her voice calm enough to steady the room without rising above it. Team 1, operating rooms 1 and 2 stay focused on thoracic trauma. Team 2, move orthopedic stabilization to the recovery suite. Convert pediatric observation into temporary vascular support. Blood bank, begin rotating universal donor units through triage before they're requested. Pharmacy, prepare emergency anticoagulation reversal kits. Keep every hallway clear. No unnecessary movement. The instructions came one after another without hesitation, each delivered with quiet certainty instead of urgency. Within minutes, the disorder that had threatened to overwhelm the hospital began forming into a coordinated rhythm. Stretchers flowed instead of colliding. Supplies reached treatment rooms before requests were spoken. Patients once trapped in bottlenecks started reaching surgery faster than anyone believed possible. Dr. Langley watched the transformation with growing disbelief. He had spent 28 years mastering trauma systems. Evelyn had reorganized the hospital in less than 10 minutes. She wasn't simply directing medicine. She was orchestrating survival itself. Another helicopter touched down outside. Then another. The final wave of casualties had arrived. Among them were combat medics carrying wounded comrades while refusing treatment for themselves. One young sergeant collapsed only after ensuring every soldier behind him had entered the emergency department. Evelyn knelt beside him personally. His pulse was fading beneath blood-soaked gloves. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to recognize her face. "We knew you'd come," he whispered. She gently squeezed his shoulder. "You did your job. Let us do ours now." The sergeant smiled faintly before losing consciousness. Nearby, several civilian nurses exchanged uneasy glances. One finally asked the question that had been hanging over everyone. "Who is she?" No one answered. No one seemed willing to guess anymore. Throughout the afternoon, fragments of Evelyn's past surfaced, not through dramatic confessions, but through the reactions of those who recognized her. A retired military surgeon arrived by helicopter to assist with emergency operations. The moment he saw Evelyn, he removed his surgical cap and embraced her with the quiet gratitude of someone greeting the person who had once saved his life. A special operations medic paused before entering surgery, just long enough to touch 2 fingers respectfully against his forehead in silent acknowledgement. Even hardened commanders lowered their voices whenever they spoke to her. None of them explained why. None of them needed to. Their respect carried decades of history hidden behind classified walls. As another operating room filled, a young resident struggled to control severe internal bleeding. Sweat rolled down his forehead despite the cool temperature. "I can't find the source," he admitted. "It's everywhere." Evelyn stood beside him without taking over. "Close your eyes for 1 second." He looked confused. "Trust me." Reluctantly, he obeyed. "Listen instead of looking. Listen to the suction. Hear where the pressure changes." The resident became still. Around him, machines beeped steadily. Suction echoed softly through the cavity. Then his eyes opened. There. He reached deeper with renewed confidence. The bleeding vessel appeared exactly where Evelyn had guided him to search. Moments later, the hemorrhage stopped. The resident stared at her in astonishment. "I never would have found it." Evelyn smiled gently. "Sometimes your ears notice what your eyes are too frightened to see." Word of her leadership spread throughout the hospital. Families waiting anxiously in corridors began asking about the calm nurse directing everyone. Patients who could barely remain conscious noticed how the panic seemed to disappear whenever she entered a room. Fear gave way to trust without anyone understanding why. It wasn't authority that followed Evelyn. It was reassurance. Late in the afternoon, the emergency department experienced its first true moment of stillness. For less than 30 seconds, no helicopters landed. No stretchers rolled through the entrance. Even the alarms softened into a distant background rhythm. The hospital breathed together. During that fragile silence, a little girl, sitting beside her injured father, looked toward Evelyn. Her father wore a military uniform stained with dried blood, but smiled weakly despite his pain. The child tilted her head with innocent curiosity. "Excuse me, miss?" Evelyn knelt until they were eye level. "Yes." The little girl looked around the room. "Why do all the soldiers salute you instead of the generals?" No one moved. Doctors stopped writing. Nurses paused beside medication carts. Even Dr. Langley lowered the patient chart in his hands. The question belonged to a child, but everyone needed the answer. Evelyn remained quiet for several seconds. Then she smiled softly. "Because they're very kind people." The little girl frowned. "That's not the real reason." Gentle laughter rippled through the exhausted staff before fading into another thoughtful silence. Evelyn brushed a loose strand of hair behind the child's ear. "A long time ago, I had a job where my responsibility was bringing people home. Sometimes I succeeded. Sometimes I couldn't. I never forgot either." The child nodded as though that simple explanation somehow made perfect sense. She reached into her pocket and handed Evelyn a small paper crane folded from hospital cafeteria napkins. "For good luck," she said. Evelyn accepted it with both hands as though receiving something priceless. "Thank you. I'll keep it." The quiet moment ended when heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. Several high-ranking officers entered escorting a man whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Though his uniform bore the stars of a commanding general, he lay unconscious on a specialized transport stretcher, his chest heavily bandaged, his breathing supported by advanced equipment. Medical staff rushed forward. Multiple injuries, severe blood loss, cardiac instability. Time was running out. As the stretcher rolled past Evelyn, the general's eyes slowly opened. His vision remained blurred, but the instant he recognized her, remarkable clarity returned. Every person nearby watched as the wounded commander struggled against pain, just long enough to raise a trembling hand into a salute. His voice barely carried beyond a whisper. "You promised. You'd never have to carry this burden again." Tears filled the eyes of more than one seasoned soldier. Evelyn gently lowered his hand and answered with heartbreaking calm. "I know, but they still needed someone to bring them home." The general closed his eyes, trusting her completely. As surgeons rushed him toward the operating room, Dr. Langley stood frozen. At last the impossible truth settled over him. Whatever name Evelyn Hart had used during the past 11 days, whatever ordinary life she had tried to build inside this hospital, the woman walking quietly beside that stretcher had once carried responsibilities so extraordinary that even the nation's highest military leaders placed their lives in her hands. And for the first time since the helicopters had arrived, Dr. Langley realized the hospital had not been rescued by luck. It had been rescued by a legend who had spent years pretending she was ordinary. The operating room doors closed behind the wounded general, and for the first time since the helicopters had appeared over the city, the emergency department seemed to hold its breath. Every physician, nurse, medic, and orderly understood that the next few hours would determine not only whether one man's life could be saved, but whether the impossible calm that had carried the hospital through the darkest day in its history would endure. Evelyn washed her hands at the surgical sink with practiced precision, the warm water running over fingers marked by faint white scars that years of ordinary hospital gloves had hidden from everyone around her. Dr. Victor Langley noticed them for the first time. They were not the scars of accidents. They were the scars of countless emergency procedures performed under conditions no civilian operating room could ever replicate. Before anyone spoke, Evelyn looked at every member of the surgical team. "Fear is contagious," she said quietly. "So is courage. Decide what you're bringing into this room." No one answered. They simply nodded. Those words settled into the silence with remarkable weight, becoming steadier than any motivational speech ever could have been. The operation began. Hours disappeared beneath brilliant surgical lights. Blood transfusions flowed continuously. Instruments changed hands with almost choreographed precision. Evelyn never reached for recognition or authority. She anticipated needs before they were spoken, positioned equipment exactly where it would be required, and quietly corrected tiny mistakes before they could become tragedies. Watching her work felt less like observing medicine and more like witnessing someone conducting an orchestra in which every heartbeat mattered. Even Dr. Langley eventually stopped questioning her decisions. He simply trusted them. Outside the operating suite, the emergency department gradually transformed from catastrophe into recovery. The final helicopter lifted away as dusk settled across the hospital roof. Families still waited anxiously, but their expressions had shifted from hopelessness toward cautious optimism. One by one, surgeons emerged from operating rooms with news that would have seemed impossible that morning. Stable, recovering, responsive, improving. The word spread through the waiting areas, like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. A mother embraced a nurse after learning her son would survive. An elderly veteran quietly removed his cap and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Young residents who had begun the day believing they would witness nothing but loss suddenly realized they had participated in the greatest rescue effort of their careers. Near midnight, the operating room doors finally opened. The general was alive. Exhausted applause did not erupt. Instead, relief swept through the hallway in soft smiles, trembling shoulders, and silent tears. It was the kind of celebration that belongs only to people who understand how close they came to failure. The general was transferred carefully into intensive care. Before sedation carried him fully into sleep, he reached for Evelyn's hand. "Thank you for coming back," he whispered. She smiled gently. "I never left. I only changed uniforms." Those standing nearby understood there was far more history behind those words than any classified document could ever contain. The following morning, the hospital awakened beneath warm golden sunlight that poured through windows still marked with fingerprints from the previous day's frantic activity. Reporters crowded outside the entrance after hearing rumors of an unprecedented military medical response. Television crews speculated endlessly about the mysterious federal directive. Government representatives arrived in dark vehicles without official markings. Hospital employees whispered in hallways whenever Evelyn walked past, though she seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. Shortly after noon, a senior defense official entered the hospital accompanied by decorated officers from every military branch represented during the disaster. They requested a private meeting in the hospital chapel. Dr. Langley and several administrators were invited to attend. The small room felt unusually quiet as sunlight filtered through stained glass, painting gentle colors across polished wooden floors. The defense official stood before Evelyn, holding a velvet presentation case. "Nurse Evelyn Hart," he began, "though everyone here knows that title captures only a fraction of who you are. Your leadership during yesterday's mass casualty event prevented losses that experts believed unavoidable. Your service to this nation extends far beyond any record we can publicly acknowledge. On behalf of a grateful country, we wish to present you with our highest civilian recognition for extraordinary medical courage." He opened the case. Inside rested a medal few people would ever see. Every officer in the room stood at attention. Dr. Langley felt privileged simply to witness the moment. Evelyn looked at the medal for several long seconds before gently closing the case with both hands. "I am deeply honored," she said softly, "but I can't accept it." Confusion filled the room. The defense official blinked. "May I ask why?" Evelyn looked toward the chapel windows, where ordinary nurses hurried across the parking lot to begin another shift. Yesterday, hundreds of people carried this hospital through impossible circumstances. Custodians cleared hallways so stretchers could move. Receptionists comforted frightened families. Young residents refused to give up when they were certain they would fail. Nurses held the hands of strangers who believed they were dying alone. If this medal belongs to anyone, it belongs to every person who chose compassion over fear. You can't pin that on one uniform. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, without command, every officer slowly lowered their salute and began applauding. Not loudly, not ceremonially, simply with profound respect. Dr. Langley found tears gathering despite decades spent believing emotions belonged outside operating rooms. After the meeting, he finally approached Evelyn alone. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "I judged you before I knew you." Evelyn smiled with characteristic warmth. "We all see the badge before we see the person sometimes. The important thing is whether we're willing to look again." He hesitated before asking the question that had lingered in his mind since the first helicopter landed. "Why did you leave? You could have remained one of the most respected trauma leaders in military history." She looked down at the paper crane the little girl had given her, now resting safely inside her pocket. Because every mission ended with a list of names I could never forget, I realized that if I stayed, one day I would remember the losses more clearly than the lives we saved. I wanted to heal people before they became memories. Dr. Langley nodded slowly. That answer explained everything. Over the following weeks, official statements described the event only as a successful coordinated emergency response. Classified files remained classified. Reporters eventually turned their attention elsewhere. The mysterious federal directive disappeared from hospital computers as quietly as it had arrived. New employees joining the hospital months later heard vague stories about an extraordinary day when 8 helicopters landed without warning, but most assumed the stories had grown larger with time. Legends often do. Evelyn returned to ordinary nursing duties. She helped elderly patients find comfortable pillows. She reassured frightened children before vaccinations. She worked overnight shifts without complaint. She celebrated recoveries quietly and mourned losses privately. Nothing about her daily routine suggested that entire military operations had once depended upon her judgment. Yet everyone who had witnessed that unforgettable day understood something they would carry for the rest of their lives. Greatness rarely announces itself. More often, it quietly asks where it is needed most. Sometimes the strongest heroes are the ones who spend their lives making sure no one ever knows their names. Early one morning, as sunlight once again spilled across the emergency department floor, Evelyn paused to straighten a blanket over a sleeping patient before beginning another routine shift. The helicopters were gone. The alarms had faded. Peace had returned to the hospital, one ordinary heartbeat at a time. She smiled gently, picked up her clipboard, and walked toward the next person who needed help, leaving behind nothing except healthier lives and quieter hearts. And perhaps that is how the greatest acts of courage are meant to end. Not with applause, but with someone choosing kindness again when no one is watching. If this story stayed with you, carry its compassion into someone else's day, because the smallest unseen act of kindness may become the miracle another person remembers forever.